I think there's an underlying current of discontent with many of the things that they experience in their daily lives. They want it to be their choice. And I think that's one of the things that kind of ties together across lots of different groups of youth in China, whether they're involved in the kind of civil society groups that I'm talking about or not. There is this underlying sense, at least from what I've been able to gather, that there's some things that need to be done differently.
My name is Diana Fu. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and also a senior non-resident fellow at Brookings Institution. I'm also a public intellectual fellows with the National Committee. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, I'm very pleased to be talking to a colleague, a dear colleague of mine, Anthony Spires, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne's Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies, and we are going to be talking about his new book, Everyday Democracy, Civil Society, Youth, and the Struggle Against Authoritarian Culture in China. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, Diana. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Looking forward to the exchange.
Yeah, so let's start with your book title, right? It's got a grabby title named Everyday Democracy. So I was thinking, in a world where even the world's supposedly most mature and robust democracies, like the United States and like South Korea, in a world where these mature democracies are being challenged by authoritarian forces, what does everyday democracy look like? And what makes it conceptually different from democracy as political science like to talk about it as an electoral institution with balance of powers and checks on rulers? So tell us a little bit about the title and the concept.
Sure. Yeah, actually, that speaks to the important motivation for the book, because the way that I have come to understand democracy, I suppose, is that there's two pieces of the puzzle. One is the institutional electoral mechanisms that you referred to that most political scientists see as essential, and I obviously would agree with that. But aside from the institutional aspects of democracy, the regular kind of structures that we've built to make the system work, the other part of it, I think, is the cultural support for democracy, where this culture of democracy is, as I see it, I think necessary to make the institutions function well and function properly. Because if you don't, at the most basic level, if I don't believe that you're equal to me and you don't believe that I'm equal to you, and we work, around that principle, then that fundamentally undermines the functioning of those institutions. But on the other hand, if we do have sort of a shared belief in equal dignity and equal mutual respect and equality, then it helps those organizations, those institutions function and makes our democracies meaningful. In terms of the what I mean by everyday democracy, I think in the book I realized that I actually don't give a succinct definition of it probably, but I'm thinking of things like the day-to-day experiences of authority and inequality that shape people's lives inside organizations and inside the groups that they belong to, as well as the small group kind of habits and practices that people develop inside associations. And in the book, I talk a lot about Tocqueville. I draw a lot on Alexis Tocqueville's analysis of democracy in America. To talk about sort of the habits of the heart. I think that plays into the ways that we treat each other when we're interacting. And I think the ways that we treat each other often reveal things about the values that underpin our social relations.
Right, so democracy, not necessarily just as an institution, but democracy as a culture, as a way of interaction, as a way of behavior. So we understand that anthropological take on democracy, but give us a couple of examples of what do you see as the basic culture of democracy? How do you see that manifested in the United States, for example? And then how does it manifest in China?
I'll give an example from the case of China, from one of my interviewees, who had participated in some of the kind of bottom-up youth-led NGOs that I focus on in the book. And as this person were talking, they said they had gone on from university, they'd gone on to work in a multinational corporation. And in this multinational corporation in China, they said it's very common to hear people talk to their boss, call their boss by their first name. And in China, this person said this would never happen, right? This is not something that you can do. I don't think that's entirely representative of non-Chinese organizations in China, of course, but I do think what's interesting is that the way of addressing one's superiors in a work setting, kind of, in that person's view at least, reflects an egalitarian ethos, or at least a deeper sense of equality than they thought you would find in a typical Chinese work setting. And this is even true in Chinese NGOs. Many groups in civil society in China where hierarchy and the trappings of hierarchy are normal and kind of even taken for granted. But beyond that, I think democratic culture, it's a lot of things, right? It's a value system that emphasizes equality, as I've talked about already, tolerance, although I don't like that word necessarily, but tolerance, and dignity, among other things, and the practices that attend to that, that are really just as important, again, as the democratic political institutions writ large, for creating and sustaining democracy. And I think, again, just not to focus on the point too much, but I think in recent years, we've seen across a range of longstanding and also newer modern democracies, including the US, Thailand, South Korea, most recently, without those cultural underpinnings and without their continual renewal, the political institutions and the structures that most of us recognize as democratic are at risk of collapsing.
I'm not based in the US right now, I'm based in Canada, but I can say of pretty much of all of North America and perhaps also of Europe that much of the equality that we've come to associate with democratic culture has sort of evaporated and been replaced by also polarization, or rather, I should say, tolerance has been replaced by polarization. Let's talk a little bit about China itself and about the empirics of your book, because you spent many years, many decades actually studying Chinese civil society, and we all know that under Xi Jinping, it has hardly been a fertile ground for civil society to bloom. So what do you see as some of the trends over the past decade under Xi Jinping for civil society? I mean, is rights advocacy dead in China? And I ask that specifically provocatively because I wrote an essay for the Wilson Center about 2 years ago, posing this question myself: is advocacy civil society? Is this civil society that advocates for people's rights, for equality, is it dead under Xi Jinping?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me talk about like maybe the longer term trend over the past decade or so. And I've spent some time in China. I was there last year, and I was there just a month ago for a couple of weeks and meeting with some of my former research contacts. And I would say in first of all, the bigger picture, yeah, things are they're much tighter for civil society groups right now in China. I think we've seen this gradual tightening, and in some cases quite sudden tightening on the space for civil society organizations to operate, to pursue their goals, whether that be advocacy or even social service delivery in some cases.
And you've written about some of these tightenings in terms of legal restrictions, in terms of the 2017 Internet INGO law and the charity law and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and even before that, I think, I look back at, as you mentioned, I've been doing work in this field for about 20 years now, and even 20 years ago, there were, which we now look back on maybe as kind of the golden era for civil society in China. I spent a lot of time in Guangdong at the time doing field work. And even during that period of time, there was still repression. It was still common for groups to be harassed by state security agents. People would still have their computers confiscated. They would still be threatened explicitly sometimes. It was still a very hard time to do a lot of the work that civil society people do. And that's true in everything from labor rights to the environment, to even education, which most of us, most of us imagine, why would an education group that just wants to give books to kids in a rural village, why would they get into trouble? But at times they did. And I think we've seen the intensification of that over the last 10 years, but I don't think it's ever
And
been.
why do you think they did? Just to explain it to our readers, right? Why would NGOs that are trying to deliver books to poor kids and, poor parts of China, especially Western China, why would the government be against that?
Well, I think, the government in China is not one single entity. And one scenario, for example, where a group is trying to work with kids in rural areas, if delivering the books to that village, for example, to a particular village, or donating books to a particular school, draws attention to the poor education in that village, it can reflect badly on the government officials that are meant to govern education, provide educational resources in that area. In some places, some government officials will welcome them in and say, "Oh, this is great. We have more books. We have more resources. It's great." In other places, they feel like they're coming under their targets, and they're coming under suspicion by outsiders, or maybe attention will be drawn to the potential for corruption or the actuality of corruption, where funding that they should have been spending on education doesn't seem to have gone to that area. So in those kinds of cases, it's quite common that NGOs would come under pressure, or any kind of volunteer groups even would come under pressure.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit more about these habits of the heart that you talked about de Tocqueville a long time ago, saying that these habits of the heart include reciprocity and equality, and you see that taking root in these civil society groups that you've followed for many years within China. So tell us one or two stories about who these groups are, what motivates them, and what specifically did you observe that made you feel like, yes, there is everyday democracy in this authoritarian regime?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think I'll say first of all, I focus in the book on a range of different kinds of civil society organizations, but or I should say, I introduce a range of different civil society organizations, but I really focus on two groups they're youth-based, it's youth-led. They draw largely on university students, and one of them works in villages, in rural villages with people who have had leprosy in the past, have been cured, but have had leprosy in the past, and have been subject to different kinds of social discrimination. The other is an education-focused group that goes into villages to provide summer camps, teaching English or art or other things that maybe kids in rural areas wouldn't have access to. And when I first encountered these groups, again, it was also about 20 years ago, I noticed that they were very different than the professionalized NGOs that I had also been studying, and some of which I've been volunteering in, and definitely different than the Gongos, the government-organized NGOs that I also encountered in my fieldwork. And just to give you a couple of examples of how the people in these groups feel like they're very different. There's a couple of things that jump out in terms of habits of the heart, I think. One is equality. So to go back to that, I think it really is a fundamental thread that runs throughout much of what I would call democratic culture and much of the analysis in the book. So in these groups, again, mostly young people, mostly university students, including some former graduates, they call each other by their first names, and that is seen as a radical departure from the norms of mainstream Chinese organizations. Even at school, even at universities, students typically refer to each other as elder brother or elder sister, which draws attention to each person's kind of relative ranking in terms of age. And in these groups, in these two groups in particular, they also usually avoid titles like class leader or president of the club or secretary or deputy secretary, which typically those kinds of titles indicate the person possesses a certain authority over others. It's very clear in these organizations, they're very anti-hierarchical. They really don't want those trappings of hierarchy, the divisions that those names and those titles kind of imply is something that they try to push back against. Another habit of the heart I would point to is, and I think it's part of the culture of democracy, is about listening. It's about active listening, and this came up over and over again in many of my interviews, and I saw it as well in practice when I was volunteering with some of these groups. Many people would relate how when they first came into the groups, they thought they were quite smart and quite capable, and that they had a really good idea of what was going on, and they thought they knew best. But inside both of these groups, they actually do teach and train newcomers to actively listen to each other. And rather than simply trying to win an argument, which is the way that one of my interviewees put it, they learn to wait until someone's finished speaking before they jump in. They learn to kind of listen behind the words that people are saying to understand why they hold the views that they do. And they do all that in order to better understand each other, but also to develop a consensus, to build a consensus so that they can work towards the group's larger goals more effectively. And those are really important things. I think diversity plays into that as well. So as a value, many people over and over again, I think in interviews mentioned that they found that there was a lot of value in people who had different perspectives. Because when you're working towards a common goal, again, getting everyone's views out and being able to discuss them in perhaps a somewhat rational fashion can help you actually identify better solutions or methods so that you can reach those common goals.
Well, we've got equality. I
Yeah.
mean, calling each other, I mean, more or less seeing each other in a more equal rather than hierarchical light, as evidenced by the way people call each other by their first names. And then you've got listening, right? Deliberation, listening, mutual respect, and then you've got diversity. But of those, I wonder if the first one, with respect to calling each other by first names, is rather just a reflection of Western society, right? Because we can think of South Korea, where it is still a robust democracy, despite what happened this past week with President Yoon, trying to impose martial law and then getting slapped back. You know, I have heard people address each other with senior. It's a very hierarchical society, and yet it is a democracy. So how do you think about that in comparison to the China case?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And if I had more time to do more research in other places and provide the evidence, I would. But I think there are many different cultures of democracy, actually. I think there are many ways that democracy gets expressed, and I think there are many ways that democratic values get expressed. In the case of China, I think it's interesting that this calling people by names, by their given names, first names, is important to a lot of people. They don't see that as Western, just to go back to that part for sure. But they rather see it, I think, as an expression of their own individuality and as respecting other people's individuality. So they kind of are approaching it from that direction. And in some of the organizations that I studied, because the two groups that I mentioned are actually quite large and they have lots of little branches. In some of them, you do still hear people refer to others by like elder sister, elder brother, that sort of terminology. But it's often used in the case of these groups, at least, as a term of endearment, as a way of showing respect, but also as a term of endearment that doesn't undermine the notion of equality between the speaker and the people they're talking with. I don't know how that plays out in South Korea, but I think it's really important. And again, just to go back to that point, just because you call someone by their first name doesn't mean that you both agree that you're equal, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit more about youth in China, right? Because you mentioned that these groups that you're studying, including the one with leprosy, they're all led by university students or graduates. And we all know that youth has always been and continues to be a very important socio-political force in China. And right now, the headlines are all about the high rates of youth unemployment. We've seen statistics as high as 1 out of 5 youth in urban China from the ages of 16 to 24 are out of a job. And that's in a country of 1.4 billion people. So this creates a lot of problems for the government. We also saw that very recently there was this huge trend of bike riding during the night that universities took to, and this was despite being apolitical. This was seen as a mass collective action that the government sought to shut down. And so, what do you make of Gen Z in China based on your research? I mean, the youth that in your groups that you study, are they a very special group of people who have learned the habits of heart, but then the rest of Gen Z China, do you see them as adopting these similar habits of the heart? Or do you feel like, yeah, that there's only certain ones that are, particularly engaged in civil society, and those are the ones that embrace everyday democracy?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I can't speak to all the kinds of people that I haven't studied, of course, but I think it's important to remember actually that youth in China, like in the US or in Australia here, are not all involved in social change or focused on political issues, right? Most people, most of the time, they just want to focus on their own life. So, as you mentioned, they want to get a job, they want to buy an apartment, they want to have a car, they want to get married, have kids maybe, they want to be able to travel once in a while overseas. Sort of that middle class lifestyle ideal is what many people aspire to, many young people, as well as their families, of course, the parents. The people that I focus on in the book are really what I would call social change makers. And they're exceptional in China, and they would be anywhere in any other place as well. But I think the values that they aspire to are not limited to them alone. So in that sense, they are at the vanguard of social change, I would say, and of democratic culture. And they may, under the right circumstances, right, become visible leaders. But under current conditions, trying to stand out through their activism or leading in public isn't really a smart choice. So part of what that means is that other young people, like the folks who are riding these bicycles, from point A to point B, right? I think there's an underlying current of discontent with many of the things that they experience in their daily lives. And I go back to hierarchy as an example of that, right? We can look to our own students, my students here at Melbourne, perhaps some of yours at Toronto, particularly a lot of young female students that I have who are questioning, I think, the way that they've been placed by the state as the future mothers of China. And they're not necessarily keen to get married and have 3 kids because it's just not realistic for them. They may end up doing that, but it's not, they want it to be their choice. And I think that's one of the things that kind of ties together across lots of different groups of youth in China, whether they're involved in the kind of civil society groups that I'm talking about or not. There is this underlying sense, at least from what I've been able to gather, that there's some things that need to be done differently. And there's some values that inform the way that they see themselves and the way they see their society that they want to be able to express in their daily lives. And they're not able to do that right now. So I think the bike riding and going out this what started off as just, I think, 4 people or something, right? becoming this massive thing with tens of thousands of people, it speaks to something, right? It speaks to this desire for some space for self-expression, for freedom, for something like that.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
again, they may not be involved in activism, but
Yeah.
there's something that ties them together.
Right, right. So last question. I wonder, I mean, I sort of look across the spectrum, and because we're both, university professors, I sort of look across the pond and say, well, Chinese youth and American youth or Australian youth or Canadian youth, they have a lot in common, really. I mean, it's the whole phenomenon of quiet quitting that we experience, that many youth have engaged in the West is expressed in the Chinese characteristic version of it being called lying flat, right? Where you're just like, I'm just gonna give up now because I can't handle the nine to nine, 6 days a week work week, and there's not much hope for climbing anyway, so I might as well just lay flat. So what this brings me to asking you about what do you Chinese youth, especially the ones that you look at, the change makers that are in China, what do you think makes them special,
What do I think makes them special? Well, I think
if anything?
I think one thing that's undeniable, and I again presume many of us who are teaching universities would see this, is that there's a real great generational divide in China. Many of the students that I encounter, many of the students the young people that I was working with in this, they see themselves as different from their parents, and they see themselves as different from their parents and their grandparents' generations. One thing that's particular about China, I think, in this group of young people is that they are, they've grown up in a time of relative prosperity, where the future is brighter and things are, consistently getting better. But now perhaps that's not necessarily the case. I think the economic situation in China has changed, of course, it's slowed down a lot. So in part, I think the people that I'm looking at are responding to that. But to take it back to the folks that are focused on in the book, I think they really what motivates them to get involved in this kind of activism. There are many, many factors, right? It's not a big surprise to me that the two groups that I focus on most are based in southern China. So there's proximity to Hong Kong. The impacts of globalization are very obvious there. It is generally a somewhat wealthier part of the world and part of China for sure. There's a lot more exposure to a diversity of ideas because of that openness, relative openness to the outside world, but also the openness of society and the diversity of society. And I think that's what's driving a lot of young people to do the kinds of things that they do, just exploring and trying to find their own way. And I would say that they don't see themselves as doing anything bad, as doing anything negative, and to the contrary, I think they're trying to find ways to make their society better, and that is why I call them social change makers, because that is what they're hoping to do.
So, Anthony, I want to thank you again for writing the book, first of all, for doing all that rich empirical work. I feel like there's a lot of books and a lot of research these days about elite politics and about US-China relations, but these kinds of deeply textured analysis of Chinese society are equally important. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff who behind the scenes helped to make this interview possible. And if you enjoyed it, we hope you will return for the future National Committee programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks to the National Committee as well for putting this together for me. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.